Hello there. Welcome to Sumit Academy. I do hope that you have subscribed to my channel. Do subscribe now so that you do not miss out on my previous or future videos. And do remember to like this video and share with your friends too. I do hope that you have had a look at my earlier video on earthquakes. In this video, we shall talk about the National Disaster Management Guidelines on Earthquakes issued by the government in April 2007. This was a path-breaking attempt by the government to not only identify the danger areas, but to plan and be prepared for earthquakes. The vision of the guidelines is zero tolerance to avoid deaths due to earthquakes. Long-term and sustained efforts are required to address the problem of earthquake risk in India, and these guidelines have been prepared to reduce the impact of earthquakes in the short term and the earthquake risk in the medium and long term. They recognize the enormous challenge in improving seismic safety because of the inadequate numbers of trained and qualified civil engineers, structural engineers, architects, and masons proficient in earthquake resistant design and construction of structures. The guidelines acknowledge the need for imparting training in earthquake-resistant design and construction to faculty members in professional colleges and for revising the curriculum in professional courses. They also stress on the need for creating public awareness on seismic risk reduction features in non-engineered construction in earthquake-prone areas. These guidelines are therefore aimed at strengthening the preparedness and mitigation efforts in India, while simultaneously improving the country's emergency response capacity. The objective of all activities related to the management of earthquakes, as laid down in these guidelines, is to evolve a community that is informed, resilient, and prepared to face such disasters in the future with a minimal loss of lives and damage to property, assets, and infrastructure. The guidelines lay down the nodal agencies and define their role in earthquake preparedness, mitigation, and response recovery phase. The first of these is the Ministry of Earth Sciences, which, as the nodal ministry, will prepare the earthquake management plan covering all aspects like earthquake preparedness, mitigation, public awareness, capacity building, training, education, research and development, documentation, earthquake response, rehabilitation, and recovery. The second is the Indian Meteorological Department, which will be the nodal agency for the monitoring of seismic activity. The third is the Bureau of Indian Standards, which will be the nodal agency for preparing earthquake-resistant building codes and other safety codes. Fourth, the guidelines lays down that communities and other stakeholders will ensure compliance to the town planning bylaws, earthquake resistant building codes, and other safety regulations, as well as their effective enforcement. Fifth, the guidelines direct key stakeholders, including central ministries and departments and state governments, to develop detailed disaster management plans, recognizing the seismic risk in their respective jurisdictions based on these guidelines. The guidelines then go on to lay down the plans for the various nodal agencies. The first of these, the India Meteorological Department, has been made the nodal agency for the monitoring of seismic activity in India through their network of seismic observatories. It will record the occurrence of earthquakes anywhere in the country and report the same to various designated functionaries in the central and state governments. The Bureau of Indian Standards has been made the nodal agency for preparing earthquake resistant building codes and other safety related codes. For structures like dams, the responsibility lies with the Central Water Commission, while for bridges, it lies with the Indian Roads Congress. The Ministry of Earth Sciences has been set up by the government to bring together the Earth Commission, the India Meteorological Department, the Earthquake Risk Evaluation Center, and other key institutions to facilitate effective coordination of the various aspects related to ocean, meteorology, seismology, marine environment, atmosphere, and earth sciences, and areas not specifically allotted to any other department or ministry. The guidelines state that as the nodal agency for earthquake management, the Ministry of Earth Sciences will prepare the disaster management plan based on the guidelines laid down by the National Disaster Management Authority. The various aspects of the disaster management plans prepared by other central ministries and departments and state governments and other stakeholder groups will be included in the disaster management plan prepared by the ministry. It will also prepare a comprehensive plan for the upgradation of the capabilities of India Meteorological Department. So how are these guidelines structured? Well, these guidelines consist of three broad sections. The first section lays down the context and approach to the management of earthquakes in India. The second gives an outline of the guidelines, while the third section gives a broad overview of the disaster management plans to be prepared by the central ministries and departments, state governments, other stakeholders, and nodal agencies. Let us now study each section. The first section covers the overview of the earthquake risk and vulnerability in India and gives a brief review of the status of earthquake management efforts, whilst giving an overview of the recent initiatives of the government for ensuring earthquake risk reduction. The first section also identifies critical areas which require special attention to ensure that the overall strategy for the management of earthquakes in India is holistic, integrated, and supportive to the development aspirations of building a modern nation. The first section further gives an introduction to the 6 pillars of earthquake management with prescribed timelines for the effective implementation of the various activities. The second section outlines each of the 6 pillars for effective earthquake management in India. The third section provides an overview of the disaster management plans to be prepared by the central ministries and departments, state governments, and other stakeholders and nodal agencies. It lays down that special attention needs to be given to ensure the earthquake safety of non-engineered construction in rural areas, as more than 61% of the buildings in rural areas are built with mud and clay, stone, brick, and or concrete, compared to 26% of similar buildings in urban areas. Right, let us now have a look at the 6 pillars for effective earthquake management in India, as laid down in the second section of the guidelines. The first pillar deals with earthquake resistant construction of new structures. It notes that even though earthquake resistant building codes and town planning bylaws and regulations exist, these are not strictly enforced. It also notes that the increasing trends of urbanization and modernization that demand the construction of flyovers, multi-storied buildings, malls, technoparks, etc. in metropolitan cities are multiplying the risks manifold. It requires all the stakeholders to ensure that hereafter all new structures are built in compliance of earthquake resistant building codes and town planning bylaws. The first pillar also deals with the critical areas of concern for the management of earthquakes in India. This includes lack of awareness among various stakeholders about seismic risk and inadequate attention to structural mitigation measures in the engineering education syllabus. The critical areas of concern also include the inadequate monitoring and enforcement of earthquake resistant building codes and town planning bylaws, the absence of systems of licensing of engineers and masons, the absence of earthquake resistant features in non-engineered construction in suburban and rural areas, the lack of formal training among professionals in earthquake resistant construction practices, and the lack of adequate preparedness and response capacity among various stakeholder groups. The second pillar deals with selective seismic strengthening and retrofitting of existing priority structures and lifeline structures. It notes that it is neither practical nor financially viable to implement strengthening and retrofitting of all existing structures in moderate and high seismic risk zones in India. It emphasizes the need for carrying out the structural safety audit of existing lifeline structures and other critical structures in earthquake prone areas and carrying out selective seismic strengthening and retrofitting. It says that such selection will be based on considerations such as the degree of risk, the potential loss of life, and the estimated financial implications for each structure, especially in high risk areas, that is, in seismic zones 3, 4, and 5. These zones have been explained in my earlier video on earthquakes. Do have a look at that. It notes that seismic retrofitting is a specialized technical task which needs to be handled by engineers proficient in this field, as any routine alteration, repair, or maintenance carried out in a structure may not always guarantee an improvement in its seismic safety and may, in fact, increase its vulnerability. It then draws up a priority list of buildings for structural safety audit, seismic strengthening, and retrofitting. This priority list firstly includes buildings of national importance like Rashtrapati Bhavan, Parliament House, Supreme Court of India, Raj Bhavans, legislatures, high courts, central and state secretariats, historical monuments, museums, heritage buildings, and strategic assets and vital installations such as power plants and water works. The priority list includes lifeline buildings, structures, and critical facilities like schools, colleges, and academic institutions, hospitals and health facilities, tertiary care centers, and all hospitals designated as major hospitals. At third priority are public utility structures like reservoirs and dams, bridges and flyovers, ports and harbors, airports, railway stations, and bus station complexes. The fourth priority has been given to important buildings that ensure governance and business continuity, like offices of the district collector and superintendent of police in districts, buildings of financial institutions like the Reserve Bank of India and the stock exchanges. The fifth and last priority is for multi-storied buildings with 5 or more floors in residential apartments, offices, and commercial complexes. We now come to the third pillar for effective earthquake management. The third pillar deals with regulation and enforcement. The guidelines emphasize the need for strengthening enforcement and regulation. This is to ensure that all stakeholders like builders, architects, engineers, and government departments responsible for regulation and enforcement adopt earthquake safe construction practices and provide for seismic safety in all design and construction activities in such a way that acceptable safety benchmarks are satisfied. The third pillar notes that the lack of easy availability of the seismic safety codes and standards, in particular their latest revisions, has been frequently cited as one of the major factors responsible for the poor implementation of earthquake resistant construction practices. Considering the overriding interest of public safety, it directs the Bureau of Indian Standards to place in the public domain, including the internet, for free download all Indian standards related to seismic safety. The third pillar calls on all state governments to adopt the model techno-legal framework for ensuring compliance of earthquake-resistant design and construction practices in all new constructions. It directs state governments to update the urban regulations by amending them to incorporate multi-hazard safety requirements. State governments are to review, revise, and update the Town and Country Planning Acts, land use and zoning regulations, building bylaws, and development control regulations DCRs. And this process will be repeated at least once every 5 years. The third pillar also lays down that all professionals dealing with safety aspects of buildings and structures will be certified through a licensing process. Such certification requirements, in accordance with the criteria involved by the model techno-legal regime, will be incorporated in the development control regulations. It also states that all artisans involved in both public and private construction projects will be certified for their skills in ensuring seismic safety. State governments will develop a scheme for setting up training centers for artisans in earthquake-prone areas. These training centers will demonstrate prototypes of earthquake-resistant construction and will also assist the appropriate dissemination of materials for creating larger public awareness on earthquake-resistant construction techniques. Currently, construction in rural areas is not governed by bylaws such as those developed for the municipal and urban areas. The third pillar asks state governments to develop suitable bylaws for rural areas where most buildings are non-engineered, keeping in mind the local conditions, and extend them to the rural areas, especially on priority in high-risk areas. The third pillar emphasizes the need for strict monitoring of modification of buildings, recognizing seismic risk and vulnerability. No relaxation in building plans which violate safety parameters in relation to earthquake safety will be permissible under any law, rule, or regulation in force. It mandates that while revising the development control regulations and master plans, it will be ensured that the seismic risk and vulnerabilities of existing buildings to withstand high intensity earthquakes is taken into account before allowing any relaxation relating to approvals for additional floors. The fourth pillar deals with awareness and preparedness. It recognizes that one of the most challenging tasks in earthquake preparedness and mitigation is the sensitization of all stakeholders to the prevalent seismic risk and educating and training them to participate in earthquake preparedness and mitigation efforts. It mandates that state governments will, in collaboration with nodal agencies and other key stakeholders, make special efforts to mobilize communities to carry out earthquake mitigation efforts. At the national level, public awareness materials like brochures, manuals, booklets, action plans, videos, and demonstration kits will be developed for creating public awareness on this subject. The fourth pillar also states that a comprehensive awareness campaign will be developed and implemented on the safe practices to be followed before, during, and after an earthquake. This campaign will also emphasize the prevalent seismic risk and vulnerability of the states, as well as highlight the roles and responsibilities of all communities and stakeholders in addressing this risk. Disaster management plans will be systematically developed to prepare stakeholders to address earthquake risk. These plans will consider the risk profile and the special characteristics of a particular geographic area and will be region specific. Preparedness will include the formulation of family and community contingency plans. Mock drills will be conducted for industrial units, offices, schools, and hospitals, as well as for specific urban and rural areas to create greater public awareness. The fourth pillar further states that in metro cities, the management of cinema theatres, malls, auditoria, community facilities, etc., will develop plans for ensuring public safety in the event of an earthquake. Emergency managers will be designated, trained, and given charge of implementing emergency response activities. Mock drills will be conducted to test the earthquake response capacity at least once in 6 months. The fourth pillar also goes into the issue of medical preparedness. It says that the disaster management plans prepared at the state and district levels will have a single all hazards medical management plan to improve emergency medical preparedness and emergency medical response. Medical preparedness will focus on likely injuries, outbreak of diseases, and other post-earthquake public health problems, including psychosocial trauma. The medical management plan will address the need to create greater awareness in all medical teams and the medical community at large to the most frequent type of injuries, illness, and other health problems caused by earthquakes. Trained medical first responders for administering first aid and resuscitation measures, at the incident site and during transportation of casualties will be identified. The fifth pillar deals with the capacity development in the fields of education, training, research and development, capacity building, and documentation. It states that state governments must endeavor to strengthen earthquake education by incorporating the best available technical and non-technical inputs on seismic safety in education curricula. Earthquake education will address the multifaceted aspects of earthquake management, especially preparedness, mitigation, and response efforts. Case histories of actual earthquakes will be used as inputs for earthquake education. The fifth pillar further states that education and training programs will be designed with greater attention on developing the capacity and skills of trainers and trained teachers. Appropriately designed science and technology courses will be introduced to orient all target groups, including school teachers and health professionals, in the subject. Central and state governments will encourage knowledge institutions to undertake research, teaching, and training, which will further contribute to improving earthquake education in India. The target groups for capacity development will include elected representatives and government officials, professionals in visual and print media, urban planners, infrastructure development experts, engineers, architects and builders, NGOs, community-based organizations, social activists, social scientists, school teachers, and school children. Specially designed public awareness programs will be developed for addressing the needs of physical, handicapped, and mentally challenged people, women, and the elderly. The National Institute of Disaster Management at the national level and the administrative training institutes at the state level have been asked to train administrative personnel from all central ministries and departments and state governments in disaster management. Training artisans in specialized skills is a critical step in ensuring proper quality control in earthquake resistant construction of all structures. Both in-class training and on-field training will be undertaken for artisans involved in different trades, including masons, barbenders, welders, carpenters, plumbers, and electricians. Such training programs will be offered to diploma holders who are involved at the civil engineering project sites. The fifth pillar goes on to state that state governments will proactively support application-oriented research and development activities to address current challenges, offer solutions, and develop new techniques. State governments will depute multidisciplinary teams for post-earthquake field investigations, document the lessons, and disseminate the same to technical and general audiences within the state. In a landmark decision, the fifth pillar notes that all currently available landslide hazard maps, including those in the Landslide Atlas of India, are small scale maps unsuitable for hazard and risk analysis at district and local levels. It directs the Ministry of Earth Sciences, in collaboration with nodal scientific agencies and institutions, to ensure the preparation of large scale landslide hazard maps of areas of high vulnerability. It also directs the Ministry of Earth Sciences to facilitate the preparation of films, manuals, and other documents targeting various stakeholders to inculcate a culture of seismic safety. This information will include specific details on the earthquake risk and vulnerability of the states, earthquake management basics, and earthquake risk mitigation for the safety of the built environment. The fifth pillar calls on state governments to assist subject specialists from academia and industry to prepare technical documents on earthquakes. Such documents will emphasize technical specifications for making new and old buildings and structures earthquake resistant and will include texts along with solved examples that deal with detailed design calculations for the seismic safety of structures. And now for the sixth pillar, which deals with emergency response. It notes that the management and control of the adverse consequences of future earthquakes will require coordinated, prompt, and effective response system at the central and state government levels, and especially at the district and the community levels. The sixth pillar states that many of the components of response initiatives are the same for different types of disasters, and systems need to be developed considering the multi hazard scenario of various regions in order to optimally utilize available resources. It further says that the severity of an earthquake is often underestimated immediately after its occurrence. The preliminary assessment of severity of the earthquake is based on its magnitude and depth collected from online seismological instruments. Field observation data, once available, will be used to make an accurate assessment. It therefore says that immediately following the occurrence of an earthquake, the India Met Department will disseminate the details of its magnitude and epicenter to all agencies concerned. This will help the state governments to undertake their response appropriately. Recognizing the support role of the local people, it says that the community in the affected neighborhood is always the first responder after any disaster. Experience has shown that over 80% of search and rescue from collapsed buildings is carried out by the local community before the intervention of the state machinery and specialized search and rescue teams arrive on the scene. The sixth pillar, therefore, says that trained and equipped teams consisting of local people will be set up in earthquake prone areas to respond effectively in the event of an earthquake. They will further be assisted by the civil defense, home guards, fire services, and NGOs. It mandates trained community level teams to assist in planning and setting up emergency shelters, distributing relief among the affected people, identifying missing people, and addressing the needs of education, healthcare, water supply, and sanitation, food, etc. of the affected community. These teams will also assist the government in identifying the most vulnerable people who may need special assistance following an earthquake. Stressing on the importance of accurate information, the sixth pillar states that after an earthquake, accurate information will be provided on the extent of the damage and the details of the response activities through electronic and print media. State governments will utilize different types of media, especially print, radio, television, and internet, to disseminate timely and accurate information. Coming to role of the corporate sector, it states that state governments will facilitate the involvement of the corporate sector in making available their services and resources to the government during the immediate aftermath of an earthquake. The corporate sector, as a part of the CSR efforts, can provide the services of hospitals, power and telecommunication, relief supplies, search and rescue equipment, earth moving equipment, and transport and logistics of movement of relief supplies to the extent possible. The sixth pillar also talks of the role of the National Disaster Response Force. The central government has set up 8 NDRF battalions for providing rapid response to disasters. All 144 teams of the NDRF will be specially equipped and trained in collapsed structure search and rescue operations. The NDRF battalions will also be provided with communication equipment for establishing last mile connectivity. The sixth pillar also recognizes the role of the state police and other governmental organizations. The police plays a very important role after an earthquake in maintaining law and order, assisting in search and rescue, and in the transportation and certification of casualties. Home guards serve as an auxiliary arm of the police force and support the district administration in various tasks. It therefore mandates that members of these organizations be trained in tasks like search and rescue and evacuation, protection of assets in evacuated areas, and management of relief camps and aid distribution centers. It says that deployment of the armed forces for post earthquake response work will be resorted to only as the last option. Specialized heavy earth moving equipment and search and rescue equipment are required immediately following an earthquake to clear debris and to carry out search and rescue of trapped people from collapsed structures. It therefore directs state governments to compile a list of such equipment and identify suppliers of such specialized equipment and enter into long-term agreements for their mobilization and deployment in the event of an earthquake. The setting up of relief camps for the people whose houses have been damaged by an earthquake and the provision of basic amenities in such camps involve logistics of mobilizing relief supplies, tents, water supply and sanitation systems, transport and communication systems, and medical supplies. It therefore states that disaster management plans at the state and district levels will address this issue in detail. Prompt and efficient emergency medical response will be provided by quick reaction medical teams, mobile field hospitals, accident relief medical vans, and helicopter ambulances. They will be activated to reach the earthquake affected areas immediately, along with dressing material, splints, portable x ray machines, mobile operation theaters, resuscitation equipment, and life saving drugs. A large number of victims may suffer from psychosocial trauma for which appropriate counseling will be provided. The sixth pillar goes on to say that the emergency medical plan will be operationalized immediately on receiving information from the earthquake affected areas. Hospitals in the affected areas will create a surge capacity for the required number of beds by discharging non critical patients and mobilize doctors and support staff, additional orthopedic equipment, and supplies at short notice. The emergency medical plan will identify the requirement of enhanced manpower, medical stores, and the requirement of blood and its components for various levels of earthquakes. After an earthquake, information centers will be set up to provide medical response information to the public, relatives of victims, and media. The designated hospitals will also identify the surgical teams that can be deployed in the field at short notice and arrange for their transport, medical equipment, and supplies. State governments will coordinate with the hospitals, both government and private, in order to facilitate effective and adequate hospital response after earthquakes. The sixth pillar further states that documentation of medical response provided after an earthquake will be done by a medical administrator. This documentation will be used as feedback for future improvement of the response strategies. Well, so much for the 6 pillars of earthquake management. But what is the purpose of these pillars? Well, these pillars will help to ensure the incorporation of earthquake resistant design features for the construction of new structures, facilitate selective strengthening and seismic retrofitting of existing priority and lifeline structures in earthquake prone areas, improve the compliance regime through appropriate regulation and enforcement, improve the awareness and preparedness of all stakeholders, introduce appropriate capacity development interventions for effective earthquake management, including education, training, R&D, and documentation, and finally will strengthen the emergency response capability in earthquake prone areas. We have spoken of earthquake management plans. The guidelines lay down that the salient activities covered by these plans will include preparation of state and district disaster management plans with specific reference to the management of earthquakes, revision of town planning bylaws, and adoption of model bylaws, wide dissemination of earthquake resistant building codes, and the National Building Code 2005 and other safety codes. It will also include training of trainers in professional and technical institutions, training professionals like engineers, architects, and masons in earthquake resistant construction, demonstration projects to disseminate earthquake resistant techniques, and public awareness campaigns on seismic safety and risk reduction, and sensitizing all stakeholders to earthquake mitigation. The plans should also include establishing appropriate mechanisms for compliance review of all construction designs submitted to urban local bodies, undertaking mandatory technical audits of structural designs of major projects by the respective competent authorities, developing an inventory of the existing built environment, assessing the seismic risk and vulnerability of the existing built environment by carrying out structural safety audits of all critical lifeline structures, and developing seismic strengthening and retrofitting standards and guidelines for existing critical lifeline structures, and then extending the exercise to the other structures in a phased manner. The plans will also lay down instructions for preparation of disaster management plans by schools, hospitals, supermalls, entertainment multiplexes, etc., and carrying out mock drills for enhancing preparedness, strengthening the Emergency Operations Center network, streamlining the mobilization of communities, the corporate sector, and other stakeholders, preparing community and village level disaster management plans with specific reference to management of earthquakes, carrying out the vulnerability assessment of earthquake prone areas, and creating an inventory of resources for effective response. The plans should include introducing earthquake safety education in schools, colleges, and universities, and conducting mock drills in these institutions, strengthening earthquake safety research and development in professional technical institutions, and finally, preparing community and village level disaster management plans with specific reference to management of earthquakes. Carrying out the vulnerability assessment of earthquake prone areas and creating an inventory of resources for effective response, introducing earthquake safety education in schools, colleges, universities, and conducting mock drills in these institutions, strengthening earthquake safety research and development in professional technical institutions, preparing documentation on lessons from previous earthquakes and their wide dissemination, developing an appropriate mechanism for licensing and certification of professionals in earthquake resistant construction techniques by collaborating with professional bodies will also be included in the disaster management plans. Other aspects of the disaster management plans should include preparing an action plan for the upgradation of the capabilities of the India Met Department and the Bureau of Indian Standards with clear roadmaps and milestones, developing appropriate risk transfer instruments by collaborating with insurance companies and financial institutions, operationalizing the NDRF battalions, operationalizing the state disaster response battalions in the states, and strengthening the medical preparedness for effective earthquake response. The disaster plans should also include enforcement and monitoring of compliance of earthquake resistant building codes, town planning bylaws, and other safety regulations. Well, that's all from me in this video. This video is based on the information freely available on the internet. No originality is claimed for the same. The intention of this video is only to prepare candidates for answering examination questions on the subject. Do like this video and do subscribe to my channel now so that you do not miss out on my previous and future videos. And if you want to have your say, you will always find me at sumitacademy20@gmail.com. Till later then, cheers.